I'm Victoria, 33 years old, and I never imagined my grandmother's 88th birthday would become the day I uncovered a truth that made my heart skip a beat. Daniel leaned in between the clinking of glasses and the sound of laughter. Grab your bag. We're leaving right now. The woman in the wheelchair is not your grandma. Today was supposed to be a moment of reunion, 3 years of waiting for a hug after every phone call that ended with "she's sleeping." But when I looked at the woman wearing that familiar moss green knit scarf, all I saw were empty eyes, a perfectly round smile as if painted on, and the grandfather clock in the living room striking a beat slower than it should. Before I tell you what really happened after Daniel said those words, leave a comment if you've ever felt your heart warning you before your mind could catch up, and hit like if you believe intuition can sometimes be the quietest, yet most powerful, lifesaver. 3 years, not a long time, but long enough for me to be completely cut off from any news about Grandma Rose. Every call home got the same answer: she's sleeping. Whether it was morning or night, summer or winter, that answer was like a door slammed shut in my face. And then, one December afternoon, as I was tidying up the small Christmas tree in my Seattle apartment, the phone rang. On the other end was my mother, her voice light as if dusted with sugar but cold underneath. "If you want to see her, come to her 88th birthday this weekend." I looked at Daniel, my eyes a mix of surprise and a flicker of hope. "We're going, right?" he asked without hesitation. Just hours later, we had booked our flights, my heart fluttering with a strange blend of excitement and unease. I told myself, this time, I would get to hug her again, feel the warmth of that moss green knit scarf she used to wrap around me every winter. That day, the plane touched down in the town where I grew up. The sky was a soft gray, the air carrying the scent of pine and the damp chill of coming snow. From a distance, her house came into view, but it no longer belonged just to her. It belonged to my mother, stepfather, and my younger sister, Grace. The front yard was strung with bright lights, a birthday banner stretched across like a declaration. The moment I stepped inside, soft music filled the air, and the faint scent of baked goods lingered, but not the familiar smell of her waffles. My mother stood at the center of the living room, smiling wide and moving with the polish of a seasoned hostess. My stepfather lingered near the window, his eyes sweeping the room every so often as if keeping watch. Grace came over to greet me with a quick hug, polite enough, but stopping short of real warmth. Then they brought her out. Or at least, the person they said was her. She sat in a wheelchair, the moss green scarf draped lightly over her shoulders, her hands placed neatly as if posed for a photograph. Her gaze swept over me, or rather, through me, so empty it made me freeze. I forced a smile, blending into the well-rehearsed chorus of toasts and greetings. But the longer I observed, the more it felt like a staged performance, everyone laughing on cue, raising their glasses in perfect sync, no one asking the kinds of questions that showed they truly cared. Lucas, my stepfather's son from his first marriage, stood beside the wheelchair like a bodyguard, his eyes watchful. Strangers milled about, exchanging small talk, yet no one spoke of any shared memory with her. The grandfather clock in the living room ticked steadily, yet I realized it was running one beat slow. That off-tempo tick made my skin prickle, as if the house itself was holding a secret. I drifted toward the buffet table, swirling my wine glass, my head giving a slight shake. A wave of weariness rose within me, and almost without warning, my mind slipped back. Back to winters long ago, when this house still smelled of waffles, when the creak of the porch swing was a lullaby, and Grandma Rose would wrap the scarf around me and whisper, "When they stay silent in the face of your pain, listen to your own heart." Back to the morning I walked out of here at 18 with a suitcase empty of family love, while Grace was begged to stay. Back to the years when she was the only one reminding me I still had a place to return to. Back then, I was 18. The age people often associate with freedom, though to me it sounded like a sentence. My mother stood on the porch steps, arms crossed, her gaze colder than a January morning. My stepfather said nothing, just leaned against the doorway, his face indifferent. They'd said enough for me to understand, "You're old enough to take care of yourself. From now on, You should go out and live on your own." A red suitcase sat at the doorstep, nearly empty. Not because I had no clothes, but because I had nothing to take with me except a few worn outfits and Grandma Rose's moss green wool scarf. That scarf had rested on my shoulders through countless winters, carrying the warmth of slender but steadfast hands. I remember the night before I left, when Grandma came into my room after my mother and stepfather had gone to bed. She set a cup of peppermint tea on the table, steam curling upward, reflecting the sorrow in her brown eyes. "Victoria," she said softly, "they think they're teaching you to be strong. But being strong doesn't mean enduring everything alone." I didn't answer, just buried my face into her shoulder. The scent of peppermint and wool intertwined, as if branding into my memory a place of safety. The next morning, I pulled my suitcase across the porch. Grace stood in the doorway, her hair messy over her shoulders, eyes glassy but lips pressed tight. My mother's hand rested lightly on her, like a tether keeping her back. "You'll stay with me, won't you?" Her voice gentle, but I knew it was an order disguised as a question. Grace nodded. That nod severed me from this family, a clean cut that didn't hurt right away, only later, when the wound began to bleed. The years after, I scraped by however I could, taking shifts at a coffee shop, renting a damp little room, learning how to make a meal from the cheapest things I could find. Each month, Grandma Rose sent me a small package, sometimes a jar of strawberry jam, sometimes an old book with "For You" written on the first page. And every winter, she sent the moss green scarf to be cleaned, then returned it with a small card, "Are you cold?" Those gifts weren't much, but they were everything. They reminded me there was still someone who believed in me, remembered me, waited for me to come home. And every time I wrapped that scarf around me, I could hear her voice in my head, "When they stay silent in the face of your pain, listen to your own heart." The false laughter of the party snapped me back to the present. The room was warm, yet I felt a chill at the back of my neck. I tightened my grip on the wine glass, my fingers brushing its smooth, cold surface. On my shoulder, the moss green scarf from my memory felt heavier. And beside me, Daniel still stood there, his eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room. That look told me we were about to step into another territory of truth. Daniel isn't the kind of man who spooks easily. He's the type who observes quietly, only speaking when it's truly necessary. But his eyes right now, they were different. Sharp, tense, and calculating, as if tracing an invisible lead. "Vic, look closely," he whispered, his breath brushing my ear amid the music and laughter. Different ears. Different jawline. Even the way she, or rather this person, moves her hands. It's not the same. I was about to push back, but then I noticed the hands on the wheelchair tremble with an odd, uneven rhythm, and every time someone came close, she, or this person, would flinch ever so slightly. Daniel shifted subtly, shielding me from Lucas's line of sight a few feet away. "I've seen your grandmother in every picture you've sent. I remember her face perfectly. That is not Rose." I forced a smile, trying to swallow the icy knot forming in my chest. "Maybe she's just aged, changed a little," I said, but even to my own ears, it sounded hollow. Daniel shook his head. "No, Vic, something's wrong. And I don't want us here for another minute until we know what it is." He took hold of my wrist, not hard, but firm enough for me to know he meant it. "Don't you see? No one here is mentioning a single specific memory about her. Not one person is checking on her, touching her, as if they're afraid." That's when I realized every interaction around her was purely for show, as if they were acting in a play where the audience was me. A clink of glasses rang out, pulling everyone's eyes to my mother, who stood in the center of the room, raising her glass of red wine like she was delivering the final scene of a film. She offered a few polished words of toast, then turned toward Rose with a smile painted far too perfectly. The room erupted in applause, but I heard Daniel draw in a sharp breath beside me. I want you to look into her eyes, he murmured. You'll know instantly. I turned, and this time, when those empty eyes locked on mine, the memories of winters by the fire, of Rose's gentle words, shattered. It felt like I was staring into a mirror that reflected the wrong version of me. Daniel tilted his head, his voice low. If I'm right, we're not just at a birthday party. We're standing in the middle of a dangerous game. I was about to ask, what are you going to do? But before I could, Daniel stepped back, his gaze sweeping the room as if mapping an escape route. We're leaving. But before we go, I need to confirm something. He signaled for me to stay put, then moved toward the buffet table, where he could watch her more closely without drawing attention. My heart pounded, unsure if it was from the cold, the fear, or some truth pressing near. In a moment, I saw Daniel give the faintest nod, as if he had just confirmed it. He walked straight back to me, leaned close, and said, Vic, get your bag. Now. I opened my mouth to ask, but he tightened his grip on my hand. I'll explain in the car. It's not safe here. And for the first time in years, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen so clearly before, genuine fear. Daniel barely gave me time to go back and say goodbye. He slipped his arm around my waist, just enough to look like a caring gesture to others, but in reality, he was gently steering me toward the front door. The laughter, the clinking glasses, the soft sway of jazz music still floated behind us, but to me, it all sounded muffled, distant, and heavy, as if wrapped in thick cotton. Lucas was still standing in the corner, his eyes seeming to follow us. But when my mother turned to call his name and ask him to carry another tray of pastries, that was the only opening we needed. Daniel pushed the door open, his hand lightly at my back, and we stepped outside. The December night air rushed in, cold enough that I could see my breath turn into thin wisps of smoke. The light from inside spilled through the window frames, turning the silhouettes within into blurred, shifting shapes. Daniel walked briskly to the car, opened the passenger door for me, then went around to his side and shut the door firmly behind him as he got in. The click of the car locks sounded sharp in the still night. He didn't start the engine right away. Instead, Daniel sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight through the windshield as if arranging the pieces in his mind before speaking. Vic, he began, his voice low and deliberate, the woman in that wheelchair, she can't be Rose. I'm sure of it. I tightened my seatbelt, my heart still pounding from the moment we left the party. What did you see? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Daniel turned to look at me, his expression so serious it made me feel like the next words out of his mouth would change everything. First, the ears, he said. Rose's ears are small and lie close to her head. But this woman, her ears are larger, with a much thicker rim. Second, the jawline. I've seen dozens of photos of Rose, including the most recent one you took. Her jaw is slightly rounded, but this woman's jaw is square, sharply angled. And finally, he paused, as if choosing his words carefully, this woman doesn't have the small mole just under her left earlobe like Rose does. A cold shiver ran down my spine. The image of Rose in my memory came into sharp focus, and yes, she'd always had that mole. I'd never thought such a tiny detail could matter so much. Daniel went on, I also noticed the way everyone treated her. No one touched her like you would a family member. They just stood nearby, said a few polite words, and stepped back. Did you see Lucas? He was guarding her, not caring for her. I swallowed hard, part of me wanting to argue that maybe they were just afraid of tiring her out. But deep down, I knew I'd seen it too. What do you think this is? I asked. Daniel took a long breath before answering. I'm not sure. But my gut says, this isn't just some petty trick. This could be a replacement. Someone impersonating Rose. And if I'm right, the reason won't be simple. The engine was still silent. We sat in the darkness, only the sickly yellow glow of the street lamp spilling onto the dashboard. I could hear my heartbeat alongside the faint rush of the wind outside. Then Daniel said slowly, each word deliberate, "Vic, we need to call the police. Right now." I whipped my head toward him. "Are you sure?" "What if?" He cut me off. "If I'm wrong, they'll verify and it'll be over. But if I'm right, she's in danger. And every second we hesitate is a second they could do something worse." I looked down at the phone in my hand, my thumb hovering over the screen. Fear wrestled with the faint hope that I was wrong. But then I remembered the hollow look in Rose's eyes, and her voice from my memory, "When they stay silent in the face of your pain, listen to your own heart." I nodded and dialed 911. When the dispatcher's voice came through, I took a deep breath and said, "I'd like to report a suspected case of impersonating an elderly person. And that person is my grandmother." Daniel squeezed my hand as I relayed every detail, the party, the way people acted, the physical differences, and how she had vanished from my life 3 years ago with the excuse that she was sleeping. A few guests began to leave, but most lingered, their conversations dull and indistinct, like echoes from far away. Lucas shifted position, now standing near the main entrance. I couldn't tell if it was coincidence or a way to control who came and went. Daniel leaned toward me, murmuring, "They'll be here in 5 minutes." I nodded slightly, keeping my eyes on my wine glass to avoid drawing attention. The air in the room shifted, just enough to notice, like a cold draft sweeping through that no one wanted to acknowledge. I could feel a few glances brushing over us. And in the center of the room, the woman in the moss-green scarf remained motionless, as if she knew something that I hadn't yet figured out. The doorbell rang in the middle of the soft jazz tune. The sound wasn't loud, but it sliced through the atmosphere like a thin blade. A few guests turned toward the door, curious. My mother's brow furrowed for just a second, but she quickly pulled her social smile back into place, as if it were nothing more than a late-arriving guest. Lucas was the one who opened it. The moment he saw 2 uniformed officers standing on the porch, he froze for half a second, just long enough for Daniel and me to notice. Then he leaned his body slightly, trying to block their view into the house. "Good evening, we received a report regarding a situation involving an elderly woman," the female officer said, her voice even but edged. "We need to speak with the homeowner." My mother stepped forward, a glass of red wine still in her hand. "Is there a problem, officer? We're in the middle of a birthday party." She smiled, but the corners of her mouth were stiff as wax. "I need to verify the identity of one of your guests," the officer replied, her eyes flicking briefly toward the woman in the wheelchair at the center of the room. "Please cooperate." The mood shifted instantly. Conversation died off, the music faded and then stopped altogether. Every gaze turned toward the wheelchair. The woman sat motionless, her eyes fixed on some distant point, her hands resting neatly on the blanket over her lap. Daniel stood close to me, his hand tightening slightly at my back as if to keep me steady. The female officer walked up to the woman, bending down to eye level. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Miller. Can you tell me your name and date of birth?" The woman blinked, her lips parting but no sound coming out. The silence stretched. Officer Miller tilted her head, her gaze shifting from the woman to my mother. "Does she have a speech condition?" My mother answered quickly, "My mother's been in poor health lately, and her memory's failing. She has trouble speaking to strangers." Her voice sounded like an explanation, but there was a hint of haste. The second officer, a tall man, stepped to the other side of the wheelchair. "If you don't mind," he said, then gently swept the woman's hair to the left. I saw Daniel hold his breath. Under the warm light, the skin was smooth, and the familiar small mole was missing. The 2 officers exchanged a brief look. Officer Miller straightened and turned to my mother. We need to see her identification and medical records immediately. Lucas cut in, "That's not necessary, this is a family matter. We can explain." "No," Daniel interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "This involves confirming a person's identity. It's not just a family matter." Silence blanketed the room. A few guests began whispering to each other. Grace stood in the far corner, her eyes unfocused in the scene, her hands clutching the fabric of her dress. My mother finally set her wineglass down, walked to the cabinet in the living room, and took out an envelope containing some papers, handing it to Officer Miller. But when it was opened, it held only faded photocopies of a birth certificate and a few generic medical bills, none of which had a photo ID. The male officer studied them, then said, "We'll need to take her to the station to confirm her identity. This is standard procedure." My mother's brows knitted, her voice tightening. "But she's very frail, you can't." "We'll ensure her safety and provide full medical support," Officer Miller replied, cutting her off. The woman in the wheelchair didn't react, only tightening her hands slightly under the blanket. That detail, small and fleeting, made my chest tighten. Daniel leaned toward me and murmured, "Vic, look. She's afraid." The officers began speaking into their radios, requesting a medical support unit. Lucas stepped back, pulling out his phone and typing something, his face shadowed. My mother turned away, but I saw her shoulders tremble, unclear if from anger or something else. I knew this was only the beginning. And as the police started to wheel the chair toward the door, I felt the taut cord that had stretched for years between me and the truth begin to snap, strand by strand. The party ended when the two police officers left. Daniel and I, exhausted, returned to the hotel, carrying with us a tangled mess of suspicion and worry weighing heavy in our minds. The hotel was bathed in a soft amber glow, so quiet I could hear the faint rustle of the bedsheets as Daniel set the suitcase down in the corner. I was still wearing the same dress from the party, my makeup mostly worn off, but my hands trembled as if I had just run through a storm. Daniel made me a cup of tea and placed it on the nightstand. "Drink, Vic, tonight was too much." He sat down beside me, his hand resting on my knee, steady like an anchor. I had just taken my first sip when the phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with the name that instantly made me freeze, Mom. Daniel looked at me, his eyes silently asking if I wanted to answer. I took a deep breath and pressed accept. "Victoria." Her voice didn't need to be loud, each word struck my ears like clashing metal. "Do you have any idea what you just did tonight?" I swallowed hard. "Mom, No, don't mom me right now," she cut in, her tone suddenly sharp. "You embarrassed the entire family in front of friends, in front of relatives. You called the police to my house in the middle of my birthday party? Who do you think you are?" I held the phone a little away from my ear, as if the distance might lessen the weight of her words. Daniel leaned in, his hand resting lightly against my back. "Mom, Just what? Just make things up? Just slander your own mother? What do you get out of this, Vic? You've always thought I wasn't good enough, haven't you? Always looking for a way to overthrow me, to drag my name through the mud so you can appear nobler." I heard the clank of a glass being set down hard on a table on her end. She was probably in the kitchen, where, whenever she was angry, every object became a vessel for her fury. "Mom, I wasn't slandering. I saw." "You saw nothing. You only see what you want to see to justify your own insolence. Who do you think that woman is? You're a real grandmother? You've been gone for years, what do you know? You're not here to see her every day." I gripped the edge of the bed, feeling the blood drain from my face. "Mom, she's not Grandma Rose." "I'm sure." She let out a dry, scornful laugh. Sure. And what makes you so sure? That husband of yours? What does he know about this family? He's only been around a few years and thinks he can interfere in my affairs? I told you from day one he'd only pull you away from this family, and tonight he proved me right. Daniel clearly heard that, his shoulders tightening, but he stayed silent. Mom, I tried to keep my voice steady. I called the police because I believe she's in danger. I couldn't ignore that. Danger? Her voice dropped lower, but it was icy. The only danger here is you. You ruined everything. You think people will see you as some kind of hero? No, Vic. You're just an ungrateful, disrespectful daughter. And from now on, don't bother stepping foot in this house again. My mouth opened, but my throat locked. I hope you're satisfied with your little drama tonight. Because you've lost this family. For good. She hung up before I could say another word. The end call tone echoed in the stillness of the hotel room. I let the phone slip from my hand and land on the bedspread. Daniel pulled me into his arms, but I didn't cry. The tears were there, hot and stinging behind my eyelids, but what rose stronger was a cold, hollow emptiness. Outside, the streets still glowed with Christmas lights. The sound of a distant car horn faded away. I sat there, listening to my own heartbeat, realizing that the final thread tying me to my mother had just been cut with a single phone call. And deep inside, a question began to form, sharper than ever. If that wasn't Grandma Rose, then who was the woman in the wheelchair tonight? The next morning we woke up early and received an urgent call from the officer asking us to come to the station that very afternoon. His voice was brief, only saying, "We've confirmed some important things, and you need to hear them in person." That alone was enough to make the morning coffee in my hand go cold. The sky was heavy and gray that day, the clouds sagging low as if snow could fall at any moment. On the way to the station, Daniel never let go of my hand, his palm warm yet tense, as though holding back a storm beneath the surface. I didn't say much. In my mind, the image of Rose at the party kept replaying in slow motion, those vacant eyes, the faint squeeze of her hand under the blanket, and that oppressive silence. When we stepped into the station's reception room, Officer Miller and her partner were waiting. On the table lay a thick file and, beside it, a sealed envelope. Miller invited us to sit, her gaze far more serious than the day before. "Before I begin," Miller started, "I need you to prepare yourselves. We've confirmed the identity of the woman in the wheelchair last night." She paused for a beat, as if to read our reaction. That was not Rose. It felt like my ears went numb for a few seconds. I had suspected as much, but hearing it from a police officer was like a real blade cutting in. Daniel spoke immediately. "Then who is she?" Miller opened the file and pulled out an old, faded portrait. "Her name is Lydia Marsh, 74 years old. She went missing nearly 2 months ago from a nursing home in the neighboring county. According to the records, she had early-stage dementia but could still recognize loved ones. The nursing home reported that a distant relative came to pick her up, with all the proper legal documents, which later turned out to be fake." I put my hand over my mouth, trying to stifle a gasp. "Then, what about Rose?" Miller's eyes softened. "We're very sorry, but we have reason to believe Rose passed away about 3 weeks ago. A witness has provided important information about where she was buried. We are proceeding with an exhumation to confirm." The air in the room thickened. I gripped Daniel's hand so tightly my nails dug into his skin. Who did this?" My voice was hoarse. Miller nodded to the male officer. He opened the sealed envelope and took out several sheets of paper, statements from 2 people, one from my aunt, and the other from Mr. Harold Klein, Rose's old war comrade from her days as an army nurse. My aunt's statement made it hard to breathe. About a month ago, I visited Rose. She whispered to me that she was being watched and not to trust anyone, not even family. I thought it was just old age paranoia. A few days later, I called back and a stranger answered, saying Rose didn't want visitors anymore. I never saw Rose again after that. I closed my eyes, picturing my aunt, a woman who often argued with my mother but had never abandoned Rose. In the recording, her voice trembled, breaking at the end. Next came Mr. Klein's statement. Rose and I have known each other since the war. Only the two of us know a secret phrase, used to confirm if one of us suspected the other was being impersonated. That winter, the snow never fell. If the other responded correctly, it meant they were safe. I went to the party last night, approached the woman in the wheelchair, and said the phrase. She just stared blankly at me. I knew right then, it wasn't Rose. The story peeled away the fog, layer by layer. I realized I was trembling, not from fear, but from rage. Why would they stage an entire charade like this? What were they trying to hide? Daniel spoke up. Do you have evidence pointing to who's behind this? Miller replied, we're investigating further, but initial signs suggest a family member was involved, at least in covering it up or being complicit. Her eyes flicked to me, then stopped at a section of the file with my mother's name. It felt as though a crack had just opened beneath my feet. My mother? I asked, my voice so small I wasn't sure I'd spoken aloud. We can't conclude yet, Miller said, but she was the one who hosted the party, and the one who arranged for Lydia Marsh to appear. And she produced another sheet of paper, a copy of a legal power of attorney transferring all of Rose's assets into your mother's name, signed only a week before she was replaced. Daniel leaned forward, his eyes sharpening. The signature, it's forged, isn't it? Miller answered, we'll have it examined, but it's very likely. Some of the strokes don't match Rose's genuine signature. I don't remember how I left the station. Every sound, every movement seemed distant. It wasn't until Daniel's hand squeezed my shoulder that I realized we were standing under falling snow, each icy flake melting instantly on my skin. He leaned in and said softly, Vic, we're not going to let this get buried. I promise. I nodded, but deep down I knew this promise wasn't just about finding justice for Rose. It was about holding on to myself, before all this truth swept away everything I'd ever believed in. And the truth can't be hidden forever. A deeper investigation was carried out, and then everything came to light. Turns out it was all a charade, carefully staged, calculated step by step, with a single goal, all of Rose's assets. 3 days after our meeting at the police station, Daniel and I received a formal invitation to attend a meeting with the family's attorney. This attorney, Mr. Barrett, was someone I'd met a few times back when I was still living at home, an older man in his 60s, neatly combed silver hair, a voice so even it felt as if he'd never let emotion seep into his work. The meeting was held in his downtown office. When we walked in, my mother was already seated there, along with Lucas and a few familiar faces from the extended family. No one looked at me for more than a second. Mr. Barrett opened with a brief statement. I've been asked to present the most recent will of Mrs. Rose. He placed a file on the table, carefully removing the paperclip. This one was signed 4 weeks ago, and there are several irregularities I am obligated to point out. The air in the room instantly tightened. I could feel my mother's gaze pressing into me, cold as ice. Mrs. Rose, Barrett continued, in this will, transferred all her real estate, bank accounts, and shares in the family business to Mrs. Linda, Victoria's mother, citing the reason to ensure the assets are safely managed. But, he paused, opening a second file. The signature on this document does not perfectly match Mrs. Rose's previous signatures. And more importantly, according to her medical records, at the time this will was signed, Mrs. Rose no longer had the legal capacity to sign any documents. A faint murmur rose from the end of the table. Lucas shifted in his seat, while my mother maintained her composed expression. "What exactly are you implying, Barrett?" my mother asked, her voice soft to the point of being unnatural. "Implying? No. I'm stating the facts," he replied. "And the fact is," he looked straight at my mother, "you used another person to impersonate Mrs. Rose in order to sign these transfer documents and this will." The entire room seemed to freeze. Daniel leaned slightly toward me, his hand on my thigh tightening its grip. My mother let out a dry laugh, its brittle sound clashing with the silence. "You think I would need to do something like that? Rose was my sister. She wanted me to handle everything." "Wanted?" Another voice cut in. Everyone turned. At the door, Officer Miller walked in, followed by Mr. Harold Klein and my aunt. Miller stepped to the center of the room, placing a stack of documents on the table. "We have security footage from the nursing home showing Mrs. Linda arriving with a woman resembling Mrs. Rose, just 1 week before Lydia Marsh went missing. And we've also obtained the handwriting analysis results. The signature is forged." I looked at my mother. She wasn't angry. She wasn't panicked. She simply sat there, her eyes cold and deep as a black hole. My aunt stepped forward, her voice trembling but clear. "Linda, I tried to believe you. But Rose told me you were planning to replace her." I thought she was speaking in delirium. Now, she took a deep breath. Now I know she was telling the truth. Mr. Klein added, "Rose once saved my life. I can't sit by knowing someone impersonated her to steal her assets." Miller nodded to a colleague standing near the door. The colleague stepped forward and placed a color photograph in front of my mother, an image of her standing beside Lydia Marsh at a notary's office, both signing documents. "Mrs. Linda," Miller said, "we're going to need your cooperation in this investigation. This is a serious matter, involving identity fraud, asset theft, and potentially connected to Mrs. Rose's death." At that, my mother finally leaned forward, her eyes cutting toward me like a blade. "Vic, are you happy now? You got what you wanted, turning your own mother into a criminal in front of everyone." I didn't respond. I knew any words now would only fuel the fire. But inside, I felt a strange overlap of pain and relief, like a mask had finally been ripped away, and I could see the truth for what it was, no matter how ugly. Daniel squeezed my hand, whispering, "Don't let her pull you down. The truth is on our side now." Barrett closed the file, his voice dropping into a grave tone. "From now on, all of Mrs. Rose's asset transactions will be frozen until the court issues a ruling. And if the allegations are proven, everything will be redistributed according to the last legitimate will." Miller motioned for my mother to stand. She didn't resist, only adjusted her coat and held her head high as if she still controlled the room. But as she passed by me, she paused, leaning close enough for only me to hear, "You've chosen your side, Vic. And you'll regret it." I didn't answer. I just watched her leave, leaving behind a heavy silence and a clear sense that this battle had only just begun. Daniel leaned in close to my ear. "We're going all the way, Vic. Not just to get justice for Mrs. Rose, but to end this toxic cycle once and for all." I nodded. In that moment, I knew, no matter how rough the waters ahead, at least I'd stepped out of the shadows of lies. And now, I would fight to make sure this truth was never buried again. The trial lasted 3 weeks, but from the very first day, I knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary hearing. Not only because of the seriousness of the case, but also because, across the aisle, my parents sat side by side, both wearing the same expression, calm to the point of coldness, as if nothing about what was about to unfold had anything to do with them. My mother's attorney opened with a long statement, skillfully painting her as a devoted sister who only wanted to protect the family's legacy from those outside the bloodline. Those outside the bloodline, of course, meant me and Daniel. Hearing those words made my blood boil, but I knew I had to hold it in. This was not the time to let emotions lead. My father, who had been mostly absent throughout the ordeal, suddenly stood up to testify. He said I had been distant from the family for a long time and was easily influenced by my husband's persuasion. Then he told a fabricated story about how I once tried to take money from my mother years ago, a story that was entirely untrue. I looked straight at him as he lied in court, and for the first time in my life, I realized there had never been such a thing as trust between us. But the truth carries its own weight. My attorney presented the evidence one by one. Security camera footage showing my mother at the nursing home with Lydia Marsh. Signature analysis proving the signature in the will was forged. A recorded phone call between my aunt and Rose, in which Rose admitted she was being watched and feared being replaced. Mr. Klein's testimony about the secret code between him and Rose, and the fact that the imposter could not respond to it. Each time a piece of evidence was introduced, I could see the composed mask on my mother's face crack just a little more. But she still tried to push back, slipping into the role of the victim. I was tricked. I didn't know that wasn't Rose. I was only following instructions from someone else. The court asked her to name that someone else. She hesitated for a few seconds, then turned and pointed directly at me, my daughter. She was the one who planned it. I only followed along. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. I stood, my voice steady and clear. Your Honor, if I planned it, why would I be the one to call the police? Why would I hand over evidence against myself? And most importantly, if I were truly the mastermind, why was the entire estate transferred to my mother's name? No one had an answer. My attorney closed the rebuttal with one sentence: the truth cannot be distorted forever. And today, we've proven that. After 3 tense weeks, the final verdict was delivered. My mother, Linda, was sentenced to 15 years in prison for identity fraud, asset embezzlement, and aiding and concealing Rose's death. My father, an accomplice in concealing evidence and facilitating illegal transactions, received 7 years. Lucas and 2 relatives involved in the impersonation scheme were sentenced to between 3 and 5 years depending on their level of involvement. The court nullified the forged will and reinstated the last valid legal will, in which I inherited the majority of Rose's estate, the old house, the savings account, and her shares in the family company. Hearing my name in the ruling didn't bring joy. It was just an odd stillness washing over me, the stillness after a storm had passed, leaving behind a wreckage I now had to clean up myself. My mother looked at me one last time before being led away. Her eyes no longer held anger, but something between resentment and the acknowledgement of defeat. She didn't say a word, but I knew, if given the chance, she would try to blame me again. I did not forgive. Not because I wanted to cling to my anger, but because forgiveness, with them, would only be a license for repetition. I chose to cut all ties completely. That night, I stood in the house Rose had left me, warm yellow light spilling over the old window frames. Daniel brought me a cup of tea and asked, "Do you regret it?" I shook my head. No. Some things, once lost, can never be reclaimed. But at least I've protected the truth. Outside, snow began to fall, white and silent, covering every trace of the dark days behind us. But I knew, beneath that snow, the truth remained intact, and it would stay there forever. On the first morning alone in her house, I brewed mint tea and opened the door to let the breeze in. Sunlight touched the wool scarf, the porch swing creaked in rhythm with the grandfather clock. I placed her journal on the table, with the letter my aunt had tucked inside. "If you're reading this, it means you've come home." I laughed through tears. Turns out coming back was never losing, it was reclaiming the right to call a memory by its name. I walked through each room, touching every object as if I were rereading an old language. The scent of age would mix with the mint from the cup in my hand, carrying me back to the afternoons she sat knitting by the window, her eyes both warm and far away. In the corner of the kitchen, the glass jar still held a few crumbs of cookies, as if she might return at any moment. I didn't clear them away. I wanted to keep them, so the kitchen would still hold the sound of her somewhere. In the flower shop, I hung a small sign, rose and mint. Whenever someone asked, I told them those were the 2 cents that had carried me through the darkest days. Jack stopped by, sharing more stories of her anonymous charity work, buying books for children in remote areas, sending envelopes to families who had just lost a loved one. Aunt Margaret learned to brew tea in the exact proportions she taught, careful as if she were guarding a sacred ritual. That afternoon, I video called Daniel. On the screen, he was holding Emma and Max, that familiar tilted smile on his face. I said, "We have a place for our children to call Grandma." He stayed quiet for a few seconds, then simply nodded, his eyes glistening. In that moment, I knew I had pulled a piece of our future out of the cycle of loss. I also knew that justice could not rewrite the past. It could not erase the nights she was afraid, the days I doubted myself. But it cleared the path for a future unclouded, one without masks, where family is not defined by blood but by the hands that hold you through the storm. I lived the rest of my life the way she loved me, quietly, warmly, and without condition. Every morning, when sunlight touches the wool scarf and the porch swing still creaks like the first day I came back, I know she's still here, somehow, in every quiet corner of this house. Dear friend, if this story touched a small corner of your heart, please hit like and leave your own comment about someone who once held you through a storm. And perhaps, when you see you're not alone in the comments, you might feel a little lighter. Don't forget to subscribe so you can experience more heartfelt stories from us, where stories are not just to be told, but to be lived.